We now return to the Bugs Bunny and Tweety Show.
I hope you enjoyed that. Alright, so as the Bugs Bunny show style bumpers indicated, we are now beginning our interview with Tom Minton, and in the interview, I am me, and Manx
Hello.
is Tom. Not Tom, but
Hi there.
reading Tom's responses. Alright, here we go.
Hello.
Alright, Mr. Minton, I want to thank you for being the first official Looney Tunes interviewee, and I'd like to first start with how Toby Danger came about. Not just of how it got picked last minute because of scheduling, but, in time, but also how the original storyboard and concept came about.
I'd be glad to, but first, I need to mention what an honor it is to be voiced by the esteemed hand puppet, Mr. Manx here.
Hold on, Manx. I told you no improv.
Yeah, I improv you not. He actually wrote that. Look. It's right here. Anyway, let me get back to it. Honored to be voiced by the esteemed hand puppet, Mr. Manx here. Not everyone gets to be articulated in a manner that was indigenous to late 1950s weekday afternoon monochrome terrestrial telecasting. All right. As for how Toby Danger came to be, around 1993 or so, Warner Brothers Animation decided to start an informal development program wherein anyone working at the studio in any capacity might actually develop their own ideas and pitch them. The notion was meant to give other people a shot than had previously gotten such an opportunity. To my knowledge, Toby Danger and Doomsday Bet ended up being the sole project that came out of that program to make it to film and be aired on television, in a roundabout manner. This brief interlude took place before the age of the development executive, which soon redefined the way in every cartoon studio that any animated program would see the light of day. So it was, in retrospect, an unusual sort of final hurrah for what we today laughingly refer to as normal human behavior.
So it was never intended to be a part of Freakazoid upon its original conception.
No. Toby Danger was purely a standalone project, originally developed and pitched as a half-hour series. I came up with the concept, drew about 90% of the development art, with the great Bob Klein doing one or two spectacular action panels, and then wrote a fleshed-out outline for the pilot episode. I intended that pilot to be a short 12-minute affair, just long enough to impart the flavor of a prospective series. The people in the development program seemed to like it, and they laughed in the right spots when I read the outline aloud for them. I took the outline and wrote a 12-minute script, and then used two of the greatest action-adventure storyboard artists then working at Warner's, Butch Lukic and Brian Burr Chin, to draw the storyboard. I chose those two because they well understood the graphic look and feel that Toby Danger was going for. Brian had worked with me at Ruby Spears Enterprises in the mid-1980s, where we both knew and worked with the great Doug Wildey, the creator of Johnny Quest. There were elements of Doug's unique personality that never made it into any of his terrific artwork, and Toby Danger was my attempt to, some degree, remedy that situation. For one thing, Doug Wildey could be hilarious, utterly side-splittingly funny in his daily verbal repartee, but one doesn't get the impulse to guffaw while watching Johnny Quest.
I saw you in the Johnny Quest DVD bonus featurette documentary. And considering that nobody ever gets paid for those things, unless you're a professional loudmouth like Harlan Ellison, I can assume that the reason you were in it is just because you're a big fan of Johnny Quest. So, at what point, once you'd started in animation, did you know that one day you would want to make a Johnny Quest parody?
I appeared in that Warner Brothers released Johnny Quest Adventures in Animation documentary short only because I had worked with and had known Doug Wildey, and because I'd done the Toby Danger short, the first and then still the only overt Johnny Quest parody ever made to air on commercial television. That couldn't be mentioned in the Johnny Quest documentary because it was made in 2004, at a point when Warner's and Amblin still hadn't agreed on certain legal matters, and they therefore didn't want the subject of Freakazoid nor any other Amblin WB projects to be brought up. And yes, for the record, I was a big fan of Doug Wildey's Johnny Quest from the moment in September of 1964 when it first hit the air on the primetime ABC carrier wave. I never dreamed that one day I'd get the opportunity to parody such an achievement as Johnny Quest, for many reasons, not the least of which was that prior to the mid-1990s timeframe in which Toby Danger was produced, it was not possible to get limited animation done anywhere on the planet that would closely enough resemble what the in-house 1964 Hanna-Barbera crew had done, with hand-inked cells under Doug Wildey's personal supervision.
When you were at Bakshi's in the late 80s working as a writer and storyboard artist on Mighty Mouse The New Adventures, a Johnny Quest parody would have been right at home, especially in an episode like Don't Touch That Dial. Did Toby Danger have any possible beginnings at Bakshi's, even if only the idea that one day you could parody Quest accurately?
Toby Danger would never have fit into the world of Mighty Mouse The New Adventures, even if I'd thought about doing it in 1987-88. The main reason that it couldn't have been done in either season of that show was that our overseas crew in Taiwan was a comedy art crew and had zero expertise in doing any sort of realistic action-adventure material, and the work of Doug Wildey requires a pretty high bar to even think about approximating.
The best thing about Doomsday Bet is, for me, that when I fell in love with it, the day of its original airing, I might add, on a Sunday morning in 1995, I had, at best, surface knowledge of what Johnny Quest was all about. And yet, right away, I knew what the joke was. What do you think this cartoon did right for a 16-year-old me to get it?
I'd have to say that TD is an acquired taste, in the same way that is JQ. One has to have at least a cursory understanding of a certain type of straight action-adventure animation to get Toby Danger. I recall that one of the very first online reactions in a 1995 chat group came from a fan who swore that Toby Danger was a parody of the work of Jack Kirby. That fan was quickly corrected by his online contemporaries, but at least it came across to him as a viewer that the parody was of a dead serious sort of action-adventure, which would then long overdue as a subject for animated satire.
And you said it was originally pitched as a series, right?
Toby Danger first aired in September of 1995, and kept airing in rotation with Freakazoid. It ended up appearing in, I think, 2 different half hours of Freakazoid, assembled that way by the film editors for some reason. It became very popular with the online community, sort of a cult hit within the cult hit of Freakazoid, to the extent that I was asked to quickly come up with a formal half-hour series pitch for Toby Danger, so toward the very end of 1995, I wrote a full half-hour pilot episode, originally titled Toby Danger in Bring Me the Head of Ben Casey. It was to have guest starred the actor who played Dr. Ben Casey, Vince Edwards. So what does Edwards do? He promptly up and dies on us. So I changed the title of that script to Bring Me the Head of Ben Kildare, as it would have come off absurd otherwise. Kildare is, of course, a reference to Dr. Kildare, a competing 1960s medical series that starred Richard Chamberlain. I got Brian Burchin to come up with additional development artwork, and a great staff WB technical artist, Ron Roche, to contribute some marvelous 1960s Doug Wildey-esque space-age prop designs. As far as I know, the project was pitched in the main WB lot to the suits but didn't sell. I don't think they understood it, and in all fairness, perhaps such a show was too early for the mass audience to really fathom. The very existence of Toby Danger arguably kicked open the door for the later Venture Brothers series, however, so there is that to consider. Aside to Mr. Manx. How you holding up there, Manx? You can take 5 and rest your digits if you absolutely need to.
Tom, with all due respect, I will decide when the rat gets a cheese break.
Hey!
Hey is for horses and you're a mouse. Next question.
Hey!
What's with all the toilet stuff?
The only toilet stuff in TD is the falling ceramic toilet in the jail cell, added by storyboard artist Butch Lukic, and the sound effect of the flush added by John McCann and or Paul Rugg, producers of Freakazoid, in post. The reason for adding the sound effect is that there is a visible and inexplicable pause, a hold in the animation, that goes on a tad too long, and it provided a reason for the sound, as the characters seem to be reacting to something off-screen. They aren't, but the sound makes it seem as though they are. This sort of band-aid work is rampant in animated series post-production, One must always work with what one gets back from overseas. There is simply no time to go back to the drawing board at that point. So the toilet appearance was an added visual gag by a storyboard artist, and the sound effect was an audio workaround. I can safely say that I put no toilet stuff in Toby Danger, as I didn't.
Are there any jokes or sight gags that you wanted that didn't make it in the final cut? If it was up to you, would you maybe have them remove the caricature of you in the opening sequence?
The only part of Toby Danger and Doomsday Bet that didn't make it to air is the epilogue, which was cut only because the script and board were slugged out for 12 minutes, and there was only an 8-minute hole in the half hour of Freakazoid that suddenly needed to be filled. The price of getting Toby Danger fully produced was to cut the last sequence and just wrap it up at the end in front of the Vegas hotel, which was done. If you're referring to any joke that I wanted in there, the original final line isn't what was aired. The original last line, uttered by the fireman, was, "Give me a government grant and I could burn down Chile." It was a perhaps far too obscure reference to the fact that everyone was a tad jealous of Dr. Danger's ongoing carte blanche government and planetary financial endowments of his many failed scientific endeavors, which are, to some degree, referenced in this later line.
I tried, Ash. To succeed would take more resources than planet Earth can supply me.
Here's a fun party game. Turn the sound down under the last shot and recite the actual last line. The thing syncs perfectly, because that line change came so late that the picture was already in work print and there was no time to reanimate the lip action. Give me a government grant and I could boing down Chile. And no, it doesn't bother me that there are caricatures of Brian Chin, Butch Lukic, and me in the opening sequence of TD. The action isn't dependent on the audience's recognition of any of those caricatures, so the scene plays on its own.
Any chance you remember why the hotel they stay in is called the Ring-a-Ding Bummer?
The hotel name, Ring-a-Ding Bummer, was a reference to Doug Wildey's actual post-hip manner of speech. Doug often came off as a Frank Sinatra Rat Pack wannabe, happily describing himself as a hotel freak, meaning that he was into comfort yet spoke with an exaggerated Brooklyn accent and hard-bitten Hollywood B-picture dialogue. I like this guy. Which never made it into any of his creative wake, with the arguable exception of an Alaskan fur trader character who sounded a lot like Doug, so that character may or may not have been written by him.
But why call it a bummer? I mean, is that some old Brooklynite term for hotel that I'm not aware of?
Ring-a-ding bummer, now that I think about it, wasn't actually a Doug Wildey expression, per se, but something that Jim Woodring, who was a longtime co-worker of mine and Brian Chin's at Ruby Spears Enterprises in the mid-1980s, said one day when humorously saying something that Doug Wildey might say. Doug did use the archaic 1960s term bummer often, and sometimes said ring-a-ding, but he never put ring-a-ding and bummer together because, as you pointed out, in his world those two entities don't go together, which is why Jim Woodring combined them, for the purpose of amusement.
Did the overseas studio that animated this cartoon ever animate Johnny Quest or similar shows of the day? I only ask because the timing and the style is exactly like Johnny Quest.
The original JQ was animated entirely in the US by Hanna-Barbera Productions, HB, with their core crew of very skilled animators, including the great Irv Spence, who had worked with Bill and Joe and Tex Avery at MGM for decades. That was the look that we were trying to match in Toby Danger, though any overseas shop couldn't really touch it. There was a 1990s reboot of JQ that HB did, which was animated in Korea, and I don't know which shop actually animated that series. I understand that Toby Danger also played some minor role in getting HB to rethink their 1990s version of JQ, in that it was said to be far closer to the spirit of the original than was the HB reboot. But not having been a part of the HB series, I can't speak for whatever actually went down over there, though that information can be found online.
You know, the look of it wasn't everything that you guys did to make it the parody right. I mean, the actors read their dialogue in that same old-school style cadence, and the music sounds like 50s needle drop. So how did those elements come to be, and were you hands-on with this aspect?
It was Andrea Romano, the longtime voice director at Warner's in the 1990s, who read the Toby Danger script and instantly knew who had to be cast for the project to really sing. Fortunately, It was then still possible to gather as many authentic voice print JQ actors to pull it off, and we were very fortunate in getting the great Don Messick, Dr. Quest himself, to voice Dr. Danger. It wasn't too long after that recording session that Messick suffered a career-ending massive stroke. As it was, there was an audible tremolo in his voice during the recording sessions that hadn't been there 30 years ago, but he was still great in that role. Mike Rode, who had voiced Race Bannon in 1964, was no longer performing due to health issues, so we cast Granville Van Dussen, who performed Race in the later JQ series produced by HB.
And the music?
Of course, that was the great scoring of the late Richard Stone, who completely got the joke when I lent him a VHS of several 1964 Johnny Quest episodes. He found Hoyt Curtin's original action scoring hilarious, and the 35-piece Warner Orchestra loved playing those overripe, action-heavy cues. In particular, lead trumpeter Rick Baptist. We were lucky that in 1995, the Warner scoring stage was still using its old analog technology to record our music sessions. Analog and magnetic tape are far more effective than digital tech in capturing brass section arrangements more faithfully. The original Johnny Quest and Richard's arrangements for Toby Danger are both heavy on the brass.
Let's go back to the look of this thing. Now, if you guys didn't ink Toby Danger the way that they inked the original Johnny Quest, then how were you able to ensure that the Korean studio that worked on this was able to get the style right, specifically the ink lines?
By the time Toby Danger was made, the overseas shops in Korea had already improved to a point where they could get a decent action-adventure look down pretty well. I think the Warner Brothers Batman the Animated Series helped them improve greatly in the direction of different animation and background styles. Plus, Toby Danger happened to be directed by Eric Radomski, a highly skilled background artist and painter in his own right, who had worked on Batman from the inception. It was Eric who figured out how to paint Batman backgrounds on black cardboard rather than the standard white Bristol board stock, building up the noir look from there. Eric was well familiar with the Doug Wildey style and knew just how to get that look from the overseas crew. Of course, we did not use ink lines on any of Toby Danger, as inking was long gone by the mid-1990s, where production cells were concerned. The storyboard was so very tight and so closely in the classic Doug Wildey style that every department that followed it was given a great start. Notice the dark shadows on everything. That is a trademark Doug Wildey look, which he accomplished in the 1960s with hand inking. Butch Lukic and Brian Chin knew how to approximate that look without having to resort to thick and thin fake ink lines, as Hanna-Barbera and even Doug himself had attempted to do in the late 1970s with Jaina of the Jungle and the Godzilla shows.
There's actually a few moments where the outlines were noticeably thick. There's a lizard who pops his head out of the desert sand and looks at Dr. Danger's semiconductor testing lab that has a very noticeably thick Johnny Quest style line.
It looks like they used thick lines, but I can tell you that in 1995, just drawing thick lines in pencil and then Xeroxing them onto cell would have yielded a scratchy-looking copy line, which would not look like the 1964 Doug Wildey Johnny Quest. I think they did 2 parallel lines and Xeroxed them, then painted in the thick black area on the reverse side with paint. That's about the only way one might avoid a scratchy Jungle Book look on the lines. That looks like what was done on that lizard.
You know, in the second shot, the lizard doesn't even move. Maybe he's part of the background.
It took extra time to do that, but far less time than it would have to hand ink everything. Yes, the scene starts with that lizard in a held pose, and he stays held. That was the beauty of JQ, and it's the beauty of this parody of JQ. Doug Wildey, as a comics artist, knew how to get the most out of held poses. There are so many held poses in TD that it becomes part of the comedy. Even the spaceman in the main title is on a north-south held cell, for the most part. You can tell the way the thing would have looked using just Xerox lines and the facial lines of the characters when they animate. They are traditional wire lines, as Gil Kane always called thin black lines. The shadow effects were done by doubling lines close enough to hand paint from the reverse, yielding the look of hand inking without actually doing it.
Is the shot where Dr. Sin pulls the switch to the semiconductor, is that a reference to Johnny Quest 2? The hand comes into frame and basically takes up the whole shot. Same question about when Dr. Danger says the clever saboteur line. He exits the frame diagonally and super quickly. I feel like I've seen that move before. Is it exclusive to JQ?
The moves you describe are just the director following the board artists and getting humor from extremely limited animation. This is very hard to pull off, though simple enough in concept. I've rarely seen it pulled off well enough to work. In TD, it does work because they didn't belabor the point, as they did with a much higher budget and a lot more time in Looney Tunes Back in Action, where they tried way too hard to contrast HB limited animation against full theatrical animation when the Scooby-Doo characters shared the screen with the Looney Tunes stars. The audience didn't get what the hell they were doing because they made the HB characters come off in some way that didn't look like the way they looked on television. They overdid their crude motion.
Another good JQ visual that you guys got right were the explosions. The original series always had a combination in their explosions of red, white, and black.
The red and black explosion was likely a choice made by Eric Radomski, as he was well aware of JQ and its graphic and color-keyed look. It was an excellent choice.
Let's talk about some of the background characters, specifically like the lizard, the ones who are painted into the background.
The old gent in the cell at left playing harmonica is supposed to be William S. Burroughs, who did time in his many countercultural adventures. Butch Lukic stuck him in there in his storyboard section. The people at the Vegas crap table just look like typical Doug Wildey designed and color-keyed ancillary characters who will be right at home in any classic JQ episode. That's Barney Fife, a.k.a. Don Knotts in the deputy uniform, standing next to John Wayne in his USMC gear. The color keying and Wildey style simulated hand inking here is as good as anyone other than Wildey himself could have done on planet Earth in 1995, especially for television animation. And that is indeed meant to be the chairman of the board, Frank Sinatra, in his late 1950s regalia, voiced by Don Messick. It's the one vocal impression that's not right on the money in this thing, but few can pull off Frank. The only impressionist who came close, in my opinion, was John Biner, and he wasn't in the booth that day.
Do you have any personal favorite lines from this cartoon?
I fondly recall the way that "just let me throw a barrel at it" came about. That line wasn't in the outline, and I was writing that scene typing on the floor of my den one Saturday morning in 1994, a few months after the Northridge earthquake. I didn't have a defined way out of the story situation at hand, and just let the action flow, until I heard Dash's voice say it in my head, and then I typed it. That line made perfect sense, so I went back and built the scene around it properly.
Okay, well, this next one is quite lengthy. Well, Tom, I consider this cartoon, this one-shot, to be the single best traditionally animated WB short produced after the studio closed in 1969. I grade it on the basis that it's a funny, hand-drawn cartoon made at Warner's at a time when the studio actually wanted, even if only to please Spielberg, to be worthy of its original quality. And I think it holds up better than any other episodic or single-produced short based on its humor and timing alone. And my last question to you is, am I crazy for thinking this?
No, you are not crazy. We actually made Toby Danger and Doomsday Bet for one solitary viewer to understand completely on the first viewing, and you're the person.
Alright. Well, that is it for my questions, so I just want to thank you, Mr. Minton, for taking the time to be in this interview. Is there anything you want to say or promote? You worked on the original Animaniacs. Thoughts on the new reboot?
I'd just like to promote the concept of a happy retirement, which is far underrated. And the only thought I harbor on the recently announced Animaniacs reboot is this: I'm glad to be retired.
Well, I don't know if I agree with you there, sir, but I've wanted to be retired well before my 20s, so I don't know exactly how underrated a concept it is, but hey, what do I know? You know, I merely comment on the art, you're on the side of the fence of the people that make the art. All right, Manx, I want to thank you too.
Actually, you should just say, thanks, Manx.
All right, thanks, Manx. You happy? I Dr. Seussed it up for you. All right, there he goes. There he goes, without nary a word. On a more serious note, I do want to thank, again, my guest, the esteemed Mr. Tom Minton, for granting me this interview. In 1988, Bakshi's Mighty Mouse just floored me. And it was the only other cartoon on Saturday morning that felt like a cartoon. The other, obviously, being Looney Tunes. And it's what led me to creating Manx. My first drawings of Manx and his brother, then named Itchy, were inspired by the mice of Mouseville and the spastic look and fun of Bakshi's Mighty Mouse. And just, I would sit there Saturday mornings just, watching this crazy show with this big marker and do these, comic strips with these mice characters. And knowing that Tom was such a big part of the fabric of that show, it's really quite humbling for me to have Manx representing him. And it's just, I don't know, I'm just, shut up, I'm not crying. But yeah, I really do want to thank Tom sincerely for granting me this interview. He doesn't do this kind of thing, and he's a very private man, so I just want to say again, Tom, I'm really honored that you considered me worthy. Okay, well, I know what's going to happen next, so I'm going to get up off this couch before the ceiling caves in and I get taken out by a porcelain throne. And, you guys, make sure to go out and get Freakazoid. It's an amazing series, and if you haven't yet, watch Toby Danger. It's vastly underrated, and it's kind of a contrast to the rest of the series, but good in its own right. It's highly structured and scripted. Very unlike the improvisational nature of Freakazoid, but that's a good thing, because as a parody, it wouldn't have worked to have a bunch of extended dialogue scenes, because the original Johnny Quest didn't have that. Parody works best when you get the thing that you're parodying right. Monty Python knew it. When they were doing those biblical epics. They did all those biblical epics in the 50s and 60s, and then they did Life of Brian. Same thing with Holy Grail. Same thing with Mel Brooks doing Young Frankenstein. He didn't shoot it a modern way. He shot it with those old lenses in black and white film stock. He got all of the old equipment that Frankenstein had for those old Universal films. It's all the original equipment. Weird Al, when Weird Al does a song parody, he has to recreate the music. Do you think he uses his own, whatever he has in his studio? No, he goes out and he gets the same musicians' instruments and equipment that they use to make it with, because you have to get that right in order for the parody to work. You gotta get the genre right. Weird Al knew it, Mel Brooks knew it, Monty Python knew it, and our own Tom Minton knew it. Tom Minton knew it when he said earlier, and he said, you don't belabor the point. Layers within layers, man. All right, well, I want to thank the aforementioned Tom Minton once again for sitting in here with us, albeit through the vocal cords of my esteemed Mr. Felt, Mr. Puppet, Manx. Again, I want to thank you, Tom, because I know you don't normally do this kind of thing, and you didn't have to, but you did. And I don't think you realize how much street cred you're giving me on this one, albeit a street in Toontown. But again, thank you very much, and thank you guys for watching these videos and for getting the subscriptions up and everything like that. It's support like this from people like you that are helping me do these kind of videos. So again, I really want to thank you, and thank you for watching this review. I'm Trevor Thompson, the self-appointed Looney Tunes critic, and until next time, dance on, folks!